Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Discord and Instagram. You should follow us. We're back in Ixalan. Chris is playing Ojer Axonil, Deepest Might. This is a burn deck commander all day long. It amplifies your pingers to deal a lot more damage. Next up is Matt playing Pantlaza, Sun Favored. He's going to cast all sorts of dinos, which is going to have him discover all sorts of dinos. Kyle is playing his favorite new deck of the set, Kutzil. This thing says draw in the command zone, so he loves it. And finally we have J-Man playing the Mycotyrant. This fungus is going to make more fungus. It's a Golgari tokens deck. What's not to love? Please subscribe if you haven't already, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. J-Man won the die roll, so he'll start by playing a forest as his land for turn, and he uses that to cast a Thallid. This thing will gain spore counters and you could cash him in later to make a sapperling. What? He passes the turn over to Chris, who draws and plays a mountain as his land, and then casts a Soul Ring on turn 1. Immediately uses that to cast a Glamdring. Gotta watch out for this guy. Afterwards, he passes the turn over to Matt. He draws and plays a Sacred Foundry as his land, and he has that enter the battlefield tapped, preserving his life total. He passes the turn over to Kyle, who plays a fancy command tower as his land, and uses that to cast Signal Pest. And this is the exact kind of creature that Kyle wants to run in his deck to trigger his commander when they deal damage. On J-Man's turn, he gets a Spore counter on his Thallid, plays a Swamp as his land, then casts a very, very fancy Abundant Growth Secret Lair drop. That allows him to draw a card and fixes his mana production. Over to Chris's turn 2, he plays another mountain as his land, and then taps out to cast his commander, Ojer Axonil, on turn 2. He passes the turn over to Matt, who plays a fancy command tower of his own. It's so majestic. Then he uses that to cast an Arcane Signet. Over to Kyle's turn, he draws and then plays a Plains as his land. Then he casts Ironpaw Aspirant. And when that enters the battlefield, he'll put a +1/+1 counter on something, and he'll choose the Ironpaw itself. Following that, he moves into the red zone. He has his Signal Pest attack Chris, and his commander doesn't have flying or reach, so Kyle's creature connects. On J-Man's turn, he gets another Spore counter on his Thallid, played a Forest, then he casts his commander, the Mycotyrant. With the Mycotyrant out, he's motivated to start descending and triggering it at its end step. On Chris's turn, he plays a mountain as his land and then casts Arcane Teachings on his commander, giving it +2/+2, as well as the ability to tap and throw damage at a creature or player. Then he casts Spear Spewer. This thing can tap to deal 1 damage to each player, but in this case, it's replaced by Ojer's ability, so it'll start doing a lot more than that. He activates his commander's ability and throws 6 damage at J-Man. He passes the turn to Matt, who plays Rockfall Vale as his land, entering the battlefield untapped. He found a Soul Ring right on time. Using that, he casts his commander, Pantlaza, Sun Favored. When that enters the battlefield, he'll discover, and with that he finds a Drover of the Mighty right off the top of his library, getting to cast that for free. He then passes the turn, and on his end step, Kyle casts Force of Virtue by exiling a white card from his hand. This pumps up his whole team, giving them +1/+1. On his turn, he plays a Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land. In this case, it's a forest, entering the battlefield tapped, and afterwards he moves into combat, attacking Matt with his Signal Pest. And with no eligible blockers, Matt takes 2. He passes the turn over to J-Man, who gets another Spore counter on his creature on his upkeep, drops a Swamp as his land, and then casts Golgari Signet, getting that ramp action on. Afterwards, he casts Talisman of Resilience, getting even more ramp action on. He passes the turn over to Chris, who draws and plays another mountain as his land for turn. Afterwards, he casts Big Score. So as an additional cost to cast that spell, he discards a card, which is an instant of note for Glamdring's sake. He then draws a few cards, makes a couple treasure, then uses said treasure and his lands to attach Glamdring to his commander, giving it +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery in his graveyard. So that's important. He then activates his Spear Spewer, dealing 7 whole points of damage to each player. Except for him, he just takes 1. Must be nice. As a follow-up, he casts Spark Jolt. He targets Kyle with it, and it would deal 1 damage, but because of his commander's replacement effect, it deals 7 instead. Chris's commander is burning his opponents out quite quickly. He then activates his commander's new ability from Arcane Teachings, and he deals a whole bunch of damage to Matt as well, dropping him to 23. He passes the turn over to Matt, who plays a mountain as his land for turn, and then casts Rishgar's Expertise. Thanks to his commander, he'll draw 5 whole cards, and then he'll get to play something for free from among them of mana value 5 or less. In this case, it's a Quartz Wood Crasher, and thanks to his commander's ability, when it enters the battlefield, he'll discover 6. And he finds Dino DNA off the top of his library, and with that onto the battlefield, he's just looking for a good imprint target in a graveyard. He goes to combat with his commander against Chris, and with no blocks, he just takes his beats, dropping to 34. After combat, Matt passes the turn over to Kyle, who draws and plays a Plains as his land, and then he casts his commander, Kutzil, Malamet, Exemplar. On his turn, he doesn't have to worry about his opponents casting spells. He moves into combat, swinging at both J-Man and Chris. His commander's second ability will have him draw cards because all of his creatures have buffs to their power and dealt combat damage to an opponent. In his second main phase, he casts a Findhorn Elves, and then he passes the turn over to J-Man, who draws, got another Spore counter on his upkeep. Then he casts Mirkwood Bats. This thing's great, and is presumably one of his win conditions. Afterwards, he plays a Prismatic Vista as his land. He immediately cracks that bad boy, taking 1 point of life, and allowing him to go find a land from his library. In this case, it's a swamp, but more importantly, he's had a permanent go to the graveyard. He then casts Ashnod's Altar, so he's getting a pretty good engine online. Now all he needs is some token production, which he does so in the form of his Thallid. He'll make a Saproling token. This will trigger Mirkwood Bats, so each one of his opponents will lose 1 point of life. He then decides to Carpe some Diem by going to combat with his commander, attacking the other threat on the board, Chris, and dropping him down to 26. At his end step, because Prismatic Vista went into the bin, he gets to make a Fungus token that can't block. In addition, this triggers his Mirkwood Bats once again, draining his opponents out. On Chris's turn, he plays Tormenting Voice, so he'll pitch a card to the bin and then draw 2 cards. And again, with each instant and sorcery going to his graveyard, it's pumping up his commander, making it even more lethal. He plays a Mountain as his land, and then casts Mana Barbs. What a jerk. So with his commander's current power, Mana Barb says deal 9 damage to his opponents whenever they tap a land. Then he casts Gut Shot, and he targets J-Man with it, given his recent development of his board state. He deals 9 points of damage to J-Man. Then he uses his Spear Spewer to deal 9 points of damage to each of his opponents, and he also takes 1. He then activates his commander, again targeting J-Man just to get the threat off the board. In response to that activated ability, he sacrifices his Saproling and his Fungus to Ashnod's Altar. This will drain each one of his opponents 2 before he gets knocked out of the game. Sorry, J-Man. Chris passed the turn to Matt, who plays a Plains. Then, using only his Mana Rocks and Dorks, he casts Generous Gift on Chris's commander, slowing things down and making sure they don't die by just tapping a land. Chris gets his 3/3 Elephant. On combat, Matt crashes into Chris with his Quartz Wood Crasher. He decides to absorb 3 points of that damage by throwing that elephant in front of him. So he takes 3 trample damage over the top. Quartz Wood Crasher triggers, so he gets a 3/3 Dinosaur Beast token. Feeling much better about where he's at, he passes the turn over to Kyle, who draws, and then he plays another Plains as his land. Kyle feels like he can take a little bit of damage thanks to Mana Barbs and use his lands to cast Welcoming Vampire, aiming to draw more cards, because that's kind of Kyle's middle name. He then casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. When that enters the battlefield, Welcoming Vampire will trigger, so he in fact draws that card, and he took 1 more point of damage thanks to Mana Barbs when he cast it. He then moves into combat, swinging at both of his opponents in such ways to guarantee the damage, as well as the card draw thanks to his commander. So he draws 2, and then he passes the turn over to Chris. He immediately recasts his commander, and because he used his lands, he takes damage, dropping him down to 12. Afterwards, he activates his Spear Spewer once again, so he'll deal 4 points of damage to each one of his opponents and take 1 himself. He then casts Geist Flame, targeting Matt. This will have him take 4 more points of damage, knocking Matt out of the game. Sorry, Matt. He passes the turn over to Kyle. Looks like Chris forgot to downtick his life total, but that's okay. On Kyle's turn, he casts Path to Exile on Chris's commander, and this would have him go and find a land, entering the battlefield tapped. Kyle casts Arbor Elf. This will trigger Welcoming Vampire, drawing him another card. He plays a Forest as his land for turn, and then does the math, realizing that he has Chris dead on board. He moves into the red zone, attacking with all of his creatures, dealing Chris enough points of damage to knock him out of the game. And that'll make Kyle the winner. Congratulations, buddy. And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it, that's the game. We hope you enjoyed. We're still having a lot of fun playing the Lost Caverns of Ixalan commanders. Let us know which one you're most excited about. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.